The Galactic Combat Training Academy on Nexus Prime had maintained its reputation for excellence through 14 millennia of operation, which was roughly 13 millennia longer than most civilizations lasted before discovering something unfortunate about antimatter containment. The Academy's pristine chrome corridors reflected the achievements of countless warriors who had graduated to defend their respective sectors, homeworlds, or in some cases favorite restaurants from annihilation. It was, by all accounts, the sort of institution that looked magnificent in recruitment holographs and even better on insurance policies. Commander Thexnol of the Saurian hegemony had overseen combat instruction for the better part of 3 centuries, which qualified him as either remarkably competent or remarkably lucky. His scaled hide bore the ritual scarification of 17 major campaigns, though he rarely mentioned that most of those scars came from paperwork-related incidents rather than actual combat. The Academy's safety protocols were so advanced that the last training fatality had occurred during the previous Galactic Age, and even that had been ruled a suicide by bureaucracy. The holographic training systems represented the pinnacle of military simulation technology. Energy constructs could replicate any weapon, any environment, and any opponent with such precision that cadets occasionally forgot they were fighting light-based projections rather than actual threats. The Academy's medical bay treated more cases of simulation sickness than actual injuries, which the administration counted as a sterling endorsement of their safety measures. These systems had been designed by the Nexari Collective, a species so devoted to perfectionism that they had spent 3,000 years refining their greeting protocols before establishing first contact with anyone. Every possible combat scenario had been mapped, categorized, and filed under appropriate threat classifications. The database contained fighting styles from over 47,000 species, ranging from the graceful plasma dancing of the ethereal domains to the chaotic rock throwing of the barely sentient Grox colonies. The Academy's current student body represented the elite of galactic society. Young Altarians practiced their ancestral sword techniques with movements so fluid they seemed to bend space-time. Crystalline beings from the Nexus rings manipulated gravitational fields with casual elegance. The insectoid hive speakers coordinated group tactics that resembled choreographed mathematics. Each species brought millennia of martial tradition, refined through countless generations of warfare, honor duels, and the occasional aggressive contract negotiation. Into this monument to galactic martial perfection had arrived 3 cycles ago a human. Commander Thexnol had initially assumed this was some sort of administrative error. Humans were barely out of their single-planet phase, still arguing about whose turn it was to take out the cosmic garbage, while more established civilizations handled serious matters like intersector politics and the proper pronunciation of diplomatic insult. The Academy's database on human combat capabilities consisted primarily of historical footage, showing them hitting each other with primitive metal objects and inexplicably celebrating afterward. The human female had introduced herself with a name that contained an improbable number of consonants, and requested assignment to the advanced combat curricula. This had prompted what the administration later classified as robust discussion among the faculty, though witnesses described it more accurately as panic-induced scaling disorder among the reptilian staff. Standard protocol suggested placing the human in remedial classes alongside species who had recently discovered fire. However, the Galactic Accord's anti-discrimination policies were surprisingly specific about educational opportunities, having been written by lawyers whose own species had evolved from particularly vindictive mollusks. The Academy found itself legally obligated to provide equal training access, regardless of what the faculty privately considered evolutionary inadequacy. The human had proven surprisingly adaptable to Academy life. She attended lectures on tactical theory, participated in physical conditioning programs, and demonstrated what her instructors generously described as enthusiasm for learning. Her academic performance remained consistently average, which everyone agreed was exactly where it should stay. The problem, Commander Thexnol was beginning to realize, lay not in what the human was learning, but in what she already knew. During practical exercises, the human displayed an unsettling tendency to improvise. When paired against holographic opponents programmed to represent standard threat levels, she would defeat them using methods that weren't precisely wrong but weren't precisely right either. Her techniques seemed to exist in some uncomfortable middle ground between effective and inexplicable, like watching someone solve mathematical equations by humming. The Academy's sophisticated monitoring systems struggled to classify her combat approach. The database contained comprehensive profiles of 47,000 species fighting methods, but none of them seemed to account for whatever the human was doing. Her movements registered as simultaneously too aggressive and too defensive, too structured and too chaotic, too calculated and too instinctive. The analysis algorithms had begun generating error reports that read like philosophical treatises on the nature of violence. More troubling were the maintenance requests that had started appearing. Holographic projectors required recalibration after her training sessions. Training facility floors needed structural assessment following her exercise. The medical bay had treated 3 cases of what they termed observation-induced vertigo among students who had watched her practice sessions. Commander Thaxnell had initially attributed these incidents to equipment sensitivity. The Academy's systems were designed for precision, not adaptation to unknown variables. A few minor glitches seemed reasonable when dealing with an unmapped species. However, the glitches were becoming less minor and considerably more frequent. The human seemed genuinely unaware that anything unusual was occurring. She would apologize profusely for any disruption, offer to help with cleanup, and invariably ask if there was anything else she could do to assist. This politeness was somehow more disturbing than outright hostility would have been. Yesterday she had approached Commander Thaxnell after advanced combat theory class. Her expression had held that particular brightness that intelligent species learn to associate with impending catastrophe. "Commander," she had said, her voice carrying that deceptive casualness that preceded most galactic disasters. "I've been thinking about the practical applications of what we've been studying." Commander Thaxnell's instinctive response had been to immediately begin updating his insurance policies, though he wasn't entirely certain why. The other students seemed to be having some difficulty with the hand-to-hand combat simulations. She had continued, apparently oblivious to the way his scales had begun their involuntary defensive bristling. "I know I'm just an exchange student, but I've had some experience with basic combat techniques." The phrase basic combat techniques had somehow managed to sound more ominous than most military threat classification. "I was wondering," she had said, and Commander Thaxnell would later swear that the Academy's ambient lighting had flickered at precisely that moment. "Can I give a demonstration?" Commander Thaxnell's first instinct was to deploy the Universal Diplomatic Solution Committee. He could form a review board, establish a subcommittee for human interaction protocols, and perhaps convene a panel to study the feasibility of feasibility study. By the time bureaucracy finished processing the request, the human would have graduated, returned to her homeworld, and possibly evolved into something less concerning. Unfortunately, the human possessed that particularly devastating combination of persistence and politeness that had historically preceded most galactic catastrophes. She waited patiently while Thaxnell explained the complex approval processes required for demonstration requests. She nodded understandingly when he detailed the extensive safety protocols that would need updating. She smiled encouragingly when he mentioned the liability assessments that would require review by 17 different departments. "That sounds like a lot of paperwork," she had said with genuine sympathy. "I could just show a few basic moves to help the other students. Nothing complicated." The word basic had triggered what Academy psychologists later classified as anticipatory stress response among the faculty. Commander Thaxnell found himself agreeing to a limited demonstration before his conscious mind had properly processed what his mouth was committing to. This was how most galactic disasters began, with good intentions and insufficient caffeine. Dr. Hex Maury, the Academy's chief tactical instructor, had attempted a last-minute intervention. Her crystalline structure resonated with harmonics that roughly translated to absolutely not in 47 languages. As a member of the Prism Collective, she had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations across multiple galactic cycles, which provided her with the kind of perspective that usually prevented catastrophically poor decisions. "Perhaps," she had suggested with the careful tone reserved for defusing antimatter bombs, "we should conduct a preliminary assessment of human combat methodologies before proceeding with public demonstration." The human had brightened at this suggestion, apparently interpreting caution as enthusiasm. "That's a great idea. I could start with some warm-up exercises to show the fundamental." The phrase warm-up exercises had somehow managed to sound more threatening than most interstellar warfare declarations. Academy Director Beltharan, whose species had evolved from particularly cautious fungi, had convened an emergency faculty meeting that lasted precisely 17 minutes. This was either a record for bureaucratic efficiency
or a sign that everyone was too terrified to prolong the discussion. The consensus had been that allowing a controlled demonstration might satisfy the humans' request, while maintaining appropriate safety measures. The decision to relocate the demonstration to Training Hall Omega had been Commander Thaxnall's idea. The facility contained the Academy's most advanced holographic systems, capable of simulating everything from solar flare combat to underwater knife fighting in methane storm. If something unexpected occurred, the safety protocols could contain any conceivable threat level. The Academy's confidence in its containment systems was based on 14 millennia of successful operation, during which the most dangerous incident had involved a malfunctioning food synthesizer that had briefly achieved sentience before being talked down by the counseling staff. The holographic training systems had been stress-tested against everything the galaxy's most creative species could devise, including the Vorthan Empire's infamous interpretive violence techniques. Word of the demonstration had spread through the student population with the efficiency typical of institutional gossip network. Cadets from 12 different species had requested permission to observe, citing educational interest in what the administration chose to interpret as multicultural curiosity rather than morbid fascination. The Altarian students arrived first, their natural grace making even casual observation look like performance art. The insectoid delegation positioned themselves with mathematical precision that suggested either tactical awareness or an instinctive understanding of optimal evacuation. The crystalline beings arranged themselves in harmonious formations that would have been beautiful if they hadn't resembled defensive barriers. Commander Thaxnall had personally overseen the safety protocol initialization. Training Hall Omega's holographic projectors hummed to life, their subsystems running through diagnostic cycles that verified everything from quantum field stability to emergency shutdown procedures. The facility's environmental controls adjusted to accommodate the diverse physiological requirements of the assembled observers, creating atmospheric zones that would keep everyone comfortable during what was expected to be a brief educational demonstration. The human had entered the training hall wearing standard Academy exercise attire, which managed to look both entirely appropriate and vaguely ominous simultaneously. Her demeanor remained cheerfully professional as she surveyed the assembled audience, the sophisticated monitoring equipment, and the holographic projection systems that represented the pinnacle of galactic military technology. "This is really impressive," she had commented, examining the control interfaces with apparent appreciation. "Your simulation capabilities are amazing. On Earth we mostly just hit things until they stop moving, or we..." The assembled faculty had exchanged glances that conveyed complex mixtures of relief and growing apprehension. The human's casual reference to her species' apparent approach to conflict resolution had provided both reassurance and cause for concern in roughly equal measures. Hexmori had activated the recording systems, ostensibly for educational purposes, but more realistically for evidence preservation. The Academy's standard practice was to document all training exercises for later analysis, quality assurance, and the occasional promotional hologram. These recordings had never previously required testimony from trauma counselors. "The simulation systems can replicate any opponent or scenario you might need," Commander Thaxnall had explained, gesturing toward the control panels with pride that would shortly prove premature. "We can adjust threat levels, environmental conditions, and tactical parameters to match any training requirement." The human had nodded appreciatively while surveying the training hall's dimensions, sight lines, and what appeared to be structural load-bearing elements. Her assessment seemed oddly thorough for someone planning to demonstrate basic combat techniques. "That's perfect," she had said, stretching in a manner that somehow managed to suggest both preparation and threat assessment. "I'll try to keep this simple so everyone can follow along." Academy Director Belterin had initiated the standard pre-exercise safety announcement, detailing emergency procedures, medical protocols, and evacuation routes with the thoroughness that had kept the Academy incident-free for millennia. Subhuman had listened politely, occasionally nodding in ways that suggested either comprehension or tactical planning. The moment had arrived with the inexorable certainty of stellar collapse. Commander Thaxnall had positioned himself at the primary control station, ready to monitor and adjust the demonstration as needed. Dr. Hexmori had taken charge of the safety systems, her crystalline form already resonating with precautionary harmonic. The assembled students had arranged themselves at what everyone agreed was a safe observation distance. The human had moved to the center of the training hall, her posture relaxed and her expression cheerfully professional. The holographic systems had completed their initialization sequences, ready to respond to whatever basic combat demonstration was about to unfold. "So," she had said, her voice carrying clearly through the hall's acoustic systems, while somehow managing to sound both reassuring and apocalyptic. "Can I give a demonstration?" The question had hung in the air like a diplomatic incident waiting to happen, while the Academy's systems hummed with the confident efficiency of technology that had never encountered anything it couldn't handle. In the observation areas, alien students shifted with the anticipatory energy of beings about to witness something educational and entirely safe. Commander Thaxnell had given his approval with the kind of authoritative confidence that usually preceded the most spectacular disasters in galactic history. The training hall's systems stood ready, the observers waited expectantly, and the human had smiled with the innocent enthusiasm that had historically preceded most of humanity's greatest achievements, and everyone else's greatest headache. Nobody had thought to ask what exactly she meant by basic. The first indication that the Academy's definition of basic differed fundamentally from the human perspective came when she casually dislocated what appeared to be her own shoulder, rotated it in a direction that violated several anatomical principles, and then snapped it back into place while explaining proper warm-up procedures. The medical monitoring systems immediately flagged this as a critical injury requiring emergency intervention, which led to an awkward moment when the human had to explain that this was merely stretching. Hexmori's crystalline structure began resonating at frequencies typically associated with seismic disturbances. The Academy's database contained detailed analyses of every known species' physical capabilities, but none of them included voluntary joint dislocation as a routine exercise. The medical AI spent several seconds attempting to classify this behavior before settling on physiologically inadvisable and recommending immediate psychiatric evaluation. "Now for basic hand-to-hand combat," the human announced with the sort of cheerful confidence that had historically preceded most species extinction events. "I'll demonstrate some fundamental techniques that anyone should be able to learn." The holographic systems activated their first combat simulation, a standard humanoid opponent programmed to represent average threat parameters. The projection materialized with the Academy's typical precision, standing roughly 2 meters tall and displaying the kind of generic menace that had adequately challenged students for millennia. The human studied her opponent for approximately 3 seconds, which was precisely 2 seconds longer than it survived. What happened next would require extensive frame-by-frame analysis to properly understand, though the Academy's recording systems were frankly inadequate for documenting events that apparently violated fundamental principles of physics. The human moved in a manner that seemed to involve too many joints, covered distances that exceeded reasonable biomechanical possibilities, and concluded with the holographic opponent scattered across the training hall in a pattern that resembled abstract art more than combat aftermath. The holographic systems attempted to compensate by increasing the threat level. Standard protocol suggested that overwhelming force was typically handled by deploying more overwhelming force, which had worked effectively for 14 millennia of Academy operation. 3 opponents materialized simultaneously, each programmed with enhanced capabilities and improved tactical coordination. This lasted approximately 4 seconds, which represented a 25% improvement over the previous attempt. Commander Thaxnell found himself frantically adjusting simulation parameters, while trying to maintain the appearance of intentional control. The Academy's systems were designed to challenge elite warriors from the galaxy's most martially accomplished civilizations, but they seemed to be encountering something outside their operational parameters. Each increase in difficulty level resulted in proportionally more spectacular destruction, as if the simulations were serving as increasingly expensive demonstrations of human problem-solving capabilities. The monitoring systems began generating warnings about unexpected stress patterns in the training hall structure. The holographic projectors were operating beyond recommended parameters, attempting to create opponents capable of surviving longer than the statistical margin of error. Energy consumption spiked as the facility's power grid struggled to maintain projection stability against forces that shouldn't have affected light-based constructs. "This is interesting," the human commented, apparently unaware that she was addressing fragments of what had once been a dozen holographic opponents. "Your simulation technology is really responsive. It keeps adapting to provide appropriate challenge level." The assembled students had begun exhibiting species-specific stress responses, Altarians were practicing defensive meditation techniques typically reserved for cosmic horror encounters. The insectoid delegation had formed protective formations that resembled mathematical expressions of pure terror. Crystalline beings were resonating at frequencies that approached ultrasonic ranges, creating harmonies that sounded like emergency broadcasts. The training hall's defensive systems had apparently concluded that they were under attack by an unknown hostile force. Containment barriers began activating throughout the facility, though they seemed designed more for keeping dangers inside than protecting anyone outside. Emergency lighting bathed everything in the kind of dramatic red illumination that typically preceded either evacuation orders or memorial services. "I think," the human said, surveying the chaos with genuine concern, "we might need to adjust the simulation parameters. These opponents seem to be malfunctioning." The holographic systems had indeed begun malfunctioning, though not in ways that anyone had previously considered possible. Projection matrices were destabilizing, creating fragments of virtual enemies that flickered in and out of existence like digitized nightmares. The environmental controls struggled to compensate for energy discharges that the monitoring systems couldn't properly classify. Commander Thaxnall realized that he was witnessing something unprecedented in the Academy's long history, a training exercise that was actively evolving beyond anyone's ability to control it. The human continued her demonstration with unwavering enthusiasm, apparently interpreting the facility's emergency responses as encouraging feedback rather than desperate attempts at damage limitation. The Academy's sophisticated AI oversight systems had begun implementing emergency protocols that hadn't been activated since the facility's construction. Blast shields descended over observation areas, while structural integrity scanners performed real-time assessments of load-bearing elements that had never previously required assessment during training exercises. And still the human continued, asking if anyone had questions while the training hall's very existence hung in the balance. The Academy's official incident report would eventually span 47 pages, though most of it consisted of technical jargon that roughly translated to "we have no idea what happened, but it was expensive." The initial draft had been considerably shorter, consisting primarily of the phrase "humans are terrifying," repeated in 17 different languages, but the legal department had insisted on more professional documentation. Training Hall Omega had been declared temporarily inoperative, which was the bureaucratic equivalent of admitting that reality had taken a brief vacation and left a forwarding address in a parallel dimension. The holographic projection systems required what the maintenance staff delicately termed existential recalibration, which involved convincing them that the laws of physics hadn't actually been repealed during the demonstration. The human had concluded her presentation by asking if anyone had questions, apparently oblivious to the fact that most of the audience was experiencing what psychologists would later classify as educational trauma. Her cheerful inquiry about whether the demonstration had been helpful coincided with the training hall's emergency systems, finally achieving some measure of control over the situation, though control was perhaps an optimistic assessment of smoking debris and emergency light. Commander Thaxnall had managed a response that he hoped conveyed gratitude while avoiding any commitment to future demonstrations. His scales had developed a permanent defensive bristling pattern that the medical staff assured him would fade within several decades. The incident report he attempted to file had been rejected by the administrative AI 3 times before he realized that the truth was simply too implausible for official documentation. Academy Director Belteran had implemented immediate policy changes with the kind of swift decisiveness that typically followed near-extinction events. The new protocols specifically addressed human participation in combat demonstrations, though the language was so carefully diplomatic that it resembled a peace treaty more than educational guideline. Legal experts from 7 species had contributed to the wording, resulting in documentation that successfully avoided mentioning humans while somehow making it clear that they were the entire point. The construction crews that arrived to assess Training Hall Omega's damage had brought equipment typically reserved for archaeological expeditions and disaster relief operations. Their preliminary reports suggested that the facility's structure had experienced localized reality distortion, which was either cutting-edge physics or an admission that traditional engineering concepts no longer applied to the affected area. The Academy's insurance company had dispatched investigators, whose species specialized in catastrophic loss assessment, having evolved from creatures that fed on the remains of civilizations that had made spectacularly poor decisions. Their evaluation process involved extensive questioning about the exact sequence of events, though none of the witnesses could provide coherent accounts of what they had actually observed. The human herself remained blissfully unaware of the administrative chaos surrounding her demonstration. She had submitted a thoughtful follow-up report suggesting improvements to the Academy's training protocols, including recommendations for more robust simulation systems and better ventilation in the training facility. Her observations about the holographic projector's limitations were technically accurate, though they failed to acknowledge that those limitations had never previously been discovered through direct application of violence. Student enrollment in advanced combat courses had experienced what the Registrar's Office diplomatically termed temporary fluctuations. Several species had requested transfers to theoretical programs, citing sudden interest in subjects like diplomatic history and agricultural management. The Academy's counseling services reported unprecedented demand for stress management therapy, though most patients simply requested confirmation that the demonstration was over and wouldn't be repeated. The maintenance staff had achieved hero status among Academy personnel for their reconstruction efforts. Their ability to restore basic functionality to Training Hall Omega was being studied by engineering departments across 3 sectors, though their methods apparently involved significant amounts of prayer, alcohol, and what they described as aggressive percussive maintenance. The facility's reopening had been delayed indefinitely, while technicians attempted to convince the holographic systems that they hadn't actually experienced trauma. Academy recruiting materials were quietly updated to include more specific language about combat demonstration policy. The changes were subtle enough to avoid admission of any particular incident, while comprehensive enough to prevent similar situations from developing in the future. Legal experts considered this a masterpiece of bureaucratic damage control, though they privately admitted that the phrase species-specific safety considerations was doing considerable diplomatic heavy lifting. The human had graduated with honors 3 months later, her academic record carefully omitting any reference to practical demonstrations, while highlighting her theoretical understanding of galactic combat principles. Her departure had been marked by what the Academy described as a celebration of multicultural exchange, though observers noted that the festivities bore a striking resemblance to relief parties.
Training Hall Omega eventually reopened as a memorial to the Academy's commitment to educational innovation, though the memorial plaques tactfully avoided mentioning what exactly was being memorialized. The facility's enhanced safety protocols had been upgraded to include what technicians described as reality anchoring systems, which were either cutting-edge technology or an admission that conventional physics could no longer be taken for granted. Commander Thexnell still occasionally received inquiries from other institutions about the Academy's human exchange program. His responses were models of diplomatic evasion, emphasizing the educational value of multicultural interaction, while carefully avoiding any specific recommendations about practical demonstrations. The phrase "still in recovery" had become his standard explanation for the Academy's current unavailability for similar programs. The human, according to recent reports, had returned to Earth and was apparently teaching self-defense classes at a local community center. The Academy's faculty had collectively agreed never to investigate whether Earth's definition of self-defense bore any resemblance to galactic standards, having learned that some questions were better left unanswered. Training Hall Omega's renovation continued indefinitely, serving as an enduring reminder that some educational experiences transcended traditional concepts of learning and entered territories that were better described as survival training for institutional infrastructure.